So how did you actually get into the work in the first place, from ordinary psychology to this system that you've created?
Well, Sidra and I met, and we fell in love. And we really, in the beginning, didn't know much what to do with each other because our primary self systems were deteriorating at a highly accelerated rate.
Because they were opposite primary self systems, we might mention.
Yeah, but we fell in love quite deeply, and we began to really work with each other because our personal situation didn't allow us to be together at that time at all. So we met once a week, and we really used the time to work with each other because we were desperate. I couldn't be in therapy anymore. I was just finished with therapy. And Sidra was never a great... she was never a therapy person, thank God. It kept her clear. And one day we were talking about vulnerability, and I said, you know, why don't you just move over? Because I had played a little bit with these selves with my children and with a couple of my nieces and nephews. I never used it in my practice. It was not a system or anything like that. And I'd never done it in a serious way. Anyhow, I asked her to move over, and she moved over, and in front of my eyes, this amazing transformation occurred, and there was this pre-verbal child who couldn't talk. I think that you actually lay down on the couch, didn't you?
No, I just put my head down.
Put your head down.
On it, there was a table, a coffee table, and I just put my head down on it, and I looked up at him, and I was amazed because I felt totally different. I'd never had that experience. It was my first separation, I think, from my primary self, which had been very much my mind, very controlling, very sensible.
But it was a shock, for an hour.
Shock.
And you have to realize she was really a New York sophisticate at that time.
And I was a psychologist. He said, you know, I wasn't into therapy, which I wasn't, even though I did it. But I was a psychologist, and I was very sophisticated. I couldn't believe this little girl.
So there was no understanding of selves as such before this experience?
Well, I had been a Jungian analyst. I mean, I was weaned on complexes, but they were never real. They weren't real people.
This little girl was real.
This little girl was real. She was a real little girl. It was not funny. It was a total shock. And the next week, I mean, I couldn't wait, and she facilitated my little boy. And there he was, you know, little Harry. And he was totally real. And that was the beginning of it, because from that point on, we went crazy with it. I mean, we went into everything we could think of. We got into the critic and pushers and power voices and all kinds of things. One time, Sidra facilitated a voice in me. We were driving in the car at the time. She facilitated a voice that I gave the name Martin Luther to. And our relationship was deepening, and this voice came out, and he hated her. He despised her. He blamed her for ruining my life. He blamed her for being too sexual. I mean, he was a total patriarch.
And you were unaware of him before he came up?
5,000% unaware. And I will tell you that if she hadn't have been able to facilitate that voice in me, our relationship would never have made it. We never could have been, because he would have destroyed it. He would have absolutely sabotaged it.
So you had had no idea of selves before in this way, not through any other sort of Gestalt or anything like that?
I had done Gestalt work. I had done, of course, very extensive Jungian work. They just were never real. See, until somebody who knows the reality of these selves facilitates you, you don't get the reality of the selves. You know, we travel all over the world. Hundreds and hundreds of people have said to us, oh, I know that. That's just Gestalt. But the fact is, not one of them ever had a clue as to what this process is about. And the reason is that they haven't had that experience of the reality of the selves, that it's a real child inside, that the critic is a real person with a real personality.
That Martin Luther really did hate me. and he really thought I was going to ruin Hal's life and that I was going to totally disrupt him and take him from his path and distract him from his work.
He was very ethical.
So where did he come from?
Well, he's an archetype. He absolute archetype, built into the structure of the psyche and waiting in the closets for influencing my life in a very strong way, because I've always been a kind of a heavy-duty, serious sort of person. He gave me a lot of that quality because people trust me a lot because of him. But I had no awareness that he was operating.
So the psyche does get born with a number of archetypes sort of loaded, the program comes preloaded.
Oh, absolutely. It's a preloaded program, and then the loading varies. So one person might have more sensuality, another person might have less, another person might have more aggression, another person have less, but the loadings are there, and then your environment is going to dictate the rest. So it's a combination of those genetic predispositions that we call archetypes and these environmental impact statements that the family system gives us. One of the things also that voice dialogue did for me personally is I was a pretty heavy guy.
Yeah.
I mean, at this point, I'm pretty funny and I got a sense of humor, and I mean, I have a good time. But in the early days, I was a heavy-duty analyst type. I really was. And as we got into this exploration of voice dialogue, it's like it gave me permission to go crazy. So I started, Sidra would facilitate me in the craziest voices. I had one character that was Oklahoma Crude.
I really loved Oklahoma Crude.
And I mean, he would talk in a cowboy accent, and I mean,
he was terrific. He said to me, you know what he said to me? He said, "I like horses, but not that way."
Yeah, that was in Santa Fe one time, And then I had a mafioso that talked with a mafia accent. He had the idea of designing mandala-shaped toilet seats and selling them to the consciousness groupies, for a lot of money. And I had a guy called Windy that would talk, letting out his breath until he couldn't breathe anymore. She would almost have a heart attack. I mean, crazy. So what it did is it gave me permission to let go, absolutely let go. Because I never got into the hippie thing, in the 60s. I just, really, it wasn't for me in some way. It didn't belong to me. And my letting go took place after we met. And I think that was necessary because I needed a safe harbor to let go in. That I think I couldn't have handled it if I had let go when I didn't have the containment in some way.
So it was a spontaneous arising of these experiences that caused you to create the voice dialogue system.
Yeah, it happened. And it happened. It absolutely just grew out of the relationship. And with these explorations, we just kept doing it because it was so fascinating. In fact, I remember one time, Hal had all these voices. I never knew who was going to be waking up in the morning with me. And I remember one time standing in the house, and this male voice comes in behind me, and I figure it's Hal, and I put out my arms, to grab him around the neck. I figured it was Hal and another subpersonality. It was the painter who'd come to paint the house. Yeah. So it started with... It started with a lot of fun and a lot of exploring each other. So it arose
based on love.
But that's just what I was going to say. It arose differently from other systems because it was based on love and acceptance and the fact that anything we found was okay because it was us. And gradually we realized the clinical implications. And gradually we introduced it into our actual work.
What do you think has been the greatest insight that this work has given you into the human condition?
That we're all alike. I think that for me, the most precious gift and the greatest insight is that wherever we go, when you talk to the selves, they're the same. And everybody's selves essentially speak the same language. Whichever primary self gets developed, that will vary from country to country. But there's a level at which we communicate when we work this way, and when we hit an aware ego, or when we speak to the vulnerable child, that just dives down beneath any kind of differences, and brings a closeness and an interaction that's absolutely holy. It's a different kind of oneness, and it's palpable.
For me, it's similar to that. It really has to do with the shift in judgment. I used to be a very judgmental person. And when you work with these selves, that really disappears. You see, people make such a fuss about trying to be compassionate and trying to be loving. They drive themselves crazy trying to be loving. And of course, when you try to be loving, you bury everything in you that's not loving. And there's an awful lot of things that aren't loving, okay? But it's really so simple, because if you simply separate, say, from a power side, from your arrogance, from your materialism, and develop an aware ego, then you can embrace power, and you can embrace arrogance, and you can embrace greed, and they're just a part of you. Who am I not to be greedy? Who am I not to be arrogant? You see, the moment I do that, the moment I accept those things in me, I automatically accept them in you. I'm sure that if you searched hard, you could find something I feel judgmental about. But at this point in my life, you'd have a pretty hard time getting there, because we've gone into so many nooks and crannies with each other, you know. And then the other thing is that this work makes you less judgmental as you facilitate. So if I'm facilitating you and I get judgmental about a voice that you're in, I would stop the work and I'd say, Michael, I'm feeling very judgmental about such and such. Would you mind facilitating that in me? Or if you didn't do it, I'd have somebody else do it. But I would do that automatically, and then I'd find out what that disowned self is. Because I know now that if I'm judging something, I have a disowned self. That's been a very beautiful gift. And what that does is that creates the compassion of the aware ego, where I'm not trying to be compassionate. You become compassionate simply because it's all in you. Everything, 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 everything.
Somebody might, on hearing this, think, well, I just want to get the whole thing sorted out and then get on with life. Where are they coming from with that opinion?
They're coming from a voice that really doesn't relate to the process of consciousness. Consciousness is a process that is forever. It's not something you can get on with so you go someplace else. It accompanies you forever and ever and ever and ever. Once you know that and really accept that, then you are not in a hurry to get along with it or to race along with it or to get someplace else, because it's always with you.
It's just life itself.
It's just life itself, yeah. Now, there are some people for whom the consciousness process doesn't speak. Well, one day they'll have to meet it. I prefer meeting it now because it enriches life and people feel better and people are happier. So it makes sense to me to take advantage of all that.
So if somebody who is just beginning this process of consciousness doesn't have the finance to go and be facilitated, or doesn't have the wherewithal, it's not available to them, what kind of things can they do, not to get the money so much, but what kind of things can they do to begin the consciousness process for themselves?
There are lots of teachers all over the world, and you could start the consciousness process any place. But one can start with the information we have available. But in a daily life, if you were just to finish watching this and then go out, it would be starting to look at who pushes your buttons, who do you judge, whom do you judge, who do you overvalue, and start looking at that, because in these people, you're beginning to be shown the lessons there are to learn. You're beginning to be shown your disowned selves, from what the disowned self is out there, you can start looking and seeing what your own primary self system is. And that's something that everybody could start to do.
So it's very important, if you're on the consciousness process, to actually get a grasp of the selves, the primary self structure. Without that, is it an impossible task to really make any real progress?
I feel that it is. You can make a lot of progress within your primary self system. You can learn new behaviors. You can modify old behaviors very, very well. If you want to truly change consciousness, the path to that, to our way of thinking, is you need to separate from the primary self, create an aware ego, and then move on from there.
There are many different people who really align themselves with many different ways of being in the world. And they are attracted to a very, very wide range of teachers and therapists. One of the things that's always dangerous for a teacher or therapist is that they're usually successful with the people that come to them. And so they generalize that into thinking that their ideas and theories are good for everybody. I don't think voice dialogue and the psychology of selves is good for everybody. Okay? I mean, theoretically, it would be nice if they could become aware of selves and separate. But the reality is it's a path that doesn't belong to everybody. And so my sense is that you have to find the frequency that belongs to you. You have to find which teachers really push the right buttons. Which teachers make you feel good? Which teachers, when they talk, do you have that sense of kind of an intuitive, yes, that works for me? And those are the teachers that you need to align yourself with. And fortunately today, there is such an amazing array of literature, of books, of audio tapes, of videotapes, of 12-step programs. I mean, I remember when I began my work as a psychotherapist on any Saturday and Sunday in June, you had no place to go as far as workshops or consciousness was concerned. It didn't exist. And today on any weekend, you have 5,000 choices as to what you can do, and many of them costing nothing and very affordable. So I think it's important to tune in to what belongs to you. Tune into what belongs to you. And when you're with a teacher or therapist and you feel somehow that you're being made wrong, when you feel judgment towards yourself or that there's something wrong with you in terms of the teaching, that's somebody to get away from.
Or a book.
Or a book, yes, a book also that makes you feel wrong about yourself. Those are the teachers and therapists to avoid. But there's enough wonderful people out there who don't have those kinds of judgmental inclinations, you see. So there's a lot of choice.
So if you get into sin and guilt and those sorts of things, it's time to move on.
Unfortunately, those kinds of traditions have extended themselves into a lot of consciousness work, and that does not serve us, absolutely not. Voice dialogue is the method that applies to the theory of the psychology of selves. The goal of the work is threefold. Number one, the development of the aware ego. In order to do this, we must learn how to separate from those selves with which we're identified and embrace the parts of us that we have rejected in the course of growing up. Once we do this, we stand between opposites, and the aware ego is in process. Secondly, once we're able to stand between opposites and make choices in this aware ego process, the dreams begin to change. and the inner teacher that is waiting to be triggered in all of us begins to make its appearance. Our dream process literally becomes a teaching process, and we begin to withdraw those feelings and projections that we have onto outer teachers and outer therapists. And the teaching starts to go where it really belongs, on an inner level. Once this aware ego process reaches this point where the inner teacher is constellated, we then begin an unpeeling of personality.
So we'll take those one at a time. The first thing that voice dialogue gives a person is awareness of the selves.
Exactly.
What are the selves?
The selves are groupings of thoughts, feelings, and behavior that are built into the human psyche. We come into this life in a certain family system, and we are conditioned by that family to behave and think and act in certain ways. The selves are the actual parts of us that develop because of this conditioning process.
So once a person has become aware of these selves, these conditioned behaviors and so on, what is the next thing that they get?
The problem is that becoming aware of these selves is difficult because we generally identify with one or two or three of them. Whenever we are completely identified with certain selves, we don't know about the rest of the selves. So the first task is to become aware of these primary selves that govern our life, so that we then can separate from them and literally learn how to embrace all of the selves.
So what is the second goal?
The second goal is more difficult to understand because a lot of people may not have experienced it. Once we have this clarification of selves and are able to recognize different points of view, different ways of behaving and feeling and thinking, our dream process begins to change. We begin to get dreams that are clarifying in nature. Sometimes we get dreams in which a voice speaks to us and gives us information. But the general name we give to this process is the birth of the inner teacher.
So an inner teacher can arise within one's own psyche and literally advise us, guide us, cause us to react in different ways?
Exactly, and the dreams come in and begin to balance our life in very significant ways. You know how an ocean liner at sea has the ability to stabilize itself. If the ship tilts to the right, the stabilizer goes to the right and forces the ship to the left. When it goes to the left, the stabilizer comes out and forces it back to the right. It's this sideward action on a ship that really makes us sick. When the unconscious begins to function as teacher, it begins to function as the roll stabilizer system on an ocean liner, and literally balances where we are. If we're too much identified with the mind, it will show us that, or it will bring up feeling in some way. If we're too identified with responsibility, it will bring up the parts of us that are not responsible. It is always helping us to balance whatever it is we're identified with.
So it seems to be a higher intelligence almost within us.
It is, in fact, a higher intelligence, an organized higher intelligence that knows exactly where it wants us to go. In the old days, they called it entelechy. That was Jung's term. A very purposive, directed intelligence that wants us literally to embrace all the selves and become all that we can possibly be.
Some of these selves obviously aren't at the surface of our mind, some of these behaviors, let's call them, or subpersonalities. Where do the others go?
The general term that we use for where they go is the unconscious. All of these selves that have been forced underground in our early upbringing don't disappear. No self ever disappears, no matter how hard we try to make it disappear. So as the primary selves develop, say the responsibility side, it tries to get rid of the parts of the person that are non-responsible. So the non-responsible, irresponsible, selfish parts go into the unconscious. There you will find them in dreams. They will break out in many different ways, and they have an amazing consequence in behavior. Because whatever it is that you try to get rid of, that you force into the unconscious, is going to manifest in your life in relationship. You are going to be either strongly, strongly judgmental towards somebody who is not responsible, or you are going to be unbelievably attracted to somebody who is irresponsible, or, as is often the case, you'll first be attracted and then repelled, or repelled and then attracted. So you get this kind of love-hate thing. That's known as marriage.
So what is the third goal of voice dialogue?
The third goal is the kind of clarification that happens as you begin to unhook from the various system of selves that comprise the personality level. So, for example, one time someone had a dream of a ball of twine that was all mushed together, and they were peeling off the layers of twine to get to the inside core. The inside core is that very vulnerable, essential energy that we come into the world with. That energy can't stay with us as we develop a personality, because if you remain identified with that energy, you get killed in the world and you become a victim.
By killed, what do you mean?
Well, it's buried very, very, very deeply, because if it's there, it's so painful. You are dysfunctional. So almost everyone has to really get rid of that kind of energy. But at some age, we have to get it back, because that energy gives us, it's almost like an essential frequency that defines who we are. So what happens in the course of transformational work, as this aware ego process develops, we separate from the personality level, and we begin to get in touch again with this primary frequency that we were born with. The other thing that happens is that as we separate from the personality level, we also become more open to energies that we call transpersonal, namely experiences that are not part of our personal experience. We become open to the mythic and archetypal nature of the psyche. That's the part of our psychology that is not a function of our personal upbringing. There are parts of our unconscious that are built into the system. They are not learned behaviors.
So what would you say is the actual power of voice dialogue?
The separation from primary selves and the discovery of disowned selves creates such a revolution in consciousness, it can hardly be imagined. And people feel like they're out of prison. They feel literally like they've gotten out of prison. You do a session with the inner critic, and they say, "Do you mean to tell me that's a voice? When I've thought for the last 50 years that was me?" They are going out of prison. So it's like an amazing discovery of a totally new land that they've discovered, in which freedom is possible. They don't have total freedom right away, but they begin to have a map of how to get out of this prison that they've been in, the prison of being identified with selves.
The prison of conditioning.
The prison of conditioning.
And what benefits can they see on a practical level from realizing this psychology of selves within their own being?
Their relationships are going to improve 42,000%. From a health standpoint, they don't have to spend all the energy that we have to spend keeping down the bad feelings that we have to keep down when we keep disowning these disowned selves, and a clarity of focus and purpose in one's life.
Are there any benefits in work and creativity?
It is inevitable when you stand between opposites that your ability to handle ambivalence increases, and with that comes much more creativity, much more creative, much more imagination.
Is it easier to make a decision rather than procrastinate?
Decision making is different because decisions may not be fast unless they have to be, but they come from a deeper place and they're much more solid, and one rarely has remorse about the decision because you've been living with both sides.
And what about how you feel in your life and your energy in your life?
Our experience with people who have gone through this process is that without exception they feel 100% better. I don't know how else to describe it.
You would say it's an essential part of life to understand this?
I would say that it's an essential part of life to understand that these selves are inside of us and to unhook from them, however it is that people do that. We have yet to find a better way than voice dialogue, but I'm open to it.
So, Sidra, what is the use of voice dialogue in practical terms, let's say, for an ordinary person in the street, in their relationships, for instance?
Well, it's particularly useful in relationships because what voice dialogue does is it gives us a sense that we're made up of selves, and it gives us a way of looking at the selves that have entered into relationship. Because what usually happens in relationships is one set of selves locks in that works. So, for instance, I may have a very sensible mother sort of part of me that enters a relationship, and you may have a very sensible sort of father part. And the two of them relate very pleasantly. We don't have fights, nothing goes wrong, but we have to leave out a lot in life because it's only one set of selves that are relating. You know what it makes me think of? It makes me think of Cinderella's sisters, who, in order to fit into the prince's slipper, would cut off their heels or their toes. And in many relationships, we cut off so much of ourselves. We have this whole variety of energies and of excitements and of vitality, and we'll narrow it down to the one thing that fits into the relationship.
So with the divorce rate worldwide in the developed countries going to 50%, can voice dialogue help keep a marriage together?
Well, there are so many things that can help keep a marriage together, but it's our belief that very, very frequently, not only does this help us to keep a marriage together, but it deepens the relationship, it broadens the relationship, it makes it more vital, it makes it more exciting. There are many more possibilities. There's much more unpredictability. Life gets more interesting, and relationship gets more interesting because you learn how to use the discomforts to teach you.
I think one of the first things is that people who enter into primary relationship have to accept the fact that it takes work. After all, you spend a lot of time going to school to learn how to be an engineer or a mechanic or a physician or an actor or whatever. It's a study. And when you enter into a relationship, it requires work and study. And I think that if you don't accept that at the very beginning, and you don't do that from the very beginning, you're in trouble. And that the marriage is essentially on its way out before it ever begins. Okay, so I feel that's a strong commitment that people have to make to each other. You have to learn how to deal with negativity. Now, there's two ways to do that. One is just out-and-out negativity. If you try to figure out negativity all the time in a relationship, it goes underground. There are always a million reasons why you shouldn't express yourself. The children are around, somebody else is there, it's going to disrupt things, it makes a mess. But you have to learn how to deal with your negativity. You've got to say the things that bother you. Then, of course, you have to learn about the judgmental issues that Sidra talked about, and that is the things you can't stand are your disowned selves. That's part of the learning all the way around. You also must learn how to be vulnerable in relationship. What does that mean? It means that I have to be able to let Sidra know when my feelings are hurt, when I'm frightened, when I feel unable to cope. Those are not traits as a man that I was trained to have. I was trained to not have that at all. Most of us are that way. But as a man, I really have had to learn how to do that. In relationship, if you can't share your vulnerability, you get into big trouble, because what happens is you bounce off of that and you go into power, and you go on the attack, and you go into judgment. If everybody in the world who was in relationship knew how to really be vulnerable, the problems would disappear to a large extent. I kid thee not. That's how important I think that is. You have to remain sexual. What does that mean? Well, let's say Sidra and I are sitting in a restaurant and this gorgeous, delicious thing slides across the floor, going to the next table, and my eyes are looking, watching her like that, you know what I mean? Now, she's a pretty smart cookie, most wives are, If I pretend, if I play let's pretend, that I don't notice that, or I'm not turned on, or I don't get attracted, I become literally son to the mother. I become a little boy, and she becomes controlling mother, literally. And I will resent her. I will resent her because I can't feel my own sexuality as a man, and I'll blame her for it. That's a very interesting thing we men do in relationship. So, for example, if I'm attracted to other women, I need to let her know that. I don't mean every single time I'm attracted to a woman. I don't mean compulsively. But basically, she has to understand that I'm a sexual man, and I find women interesting, and I'm attracted to them, and that's the way it is. Now, she has to do the same thing. Because if she pretends that she's this little girl that isn't attracted to anybody but her little husband, she will bore me to death, just like I'll bore her to death. You cannot believe how often in relationship the Aphrodite energy dies on the wedding night.
Aphrodite energy meaning what?
The sensual energy. That a woman can be very, very sensual coming into the marriage, but somehow, once she misses somebody, it's not okay to have an active Aphrodite. Or the man criticizes her because she flirted too much at a party and Aphrodite goes underground. From a man's standpoint, if I want to have Aphrodite between us in relationship, if I want Sidra to have an active Aphrodite, I have to understand very clearly that her Aphrodite has to be out all the time. Now that may be painful at times, because she is going to have her attractions, and those attractions can be very serious sometimes. But by not talking about those attractions, you take a dagger and you stick it into the heart of the marriage, because the marriage becomes sexless at that point. So it's a painful issue. Sidra and I have a very, very strong feeling about relationship as a joint venture. I mean, in every aspect, a joint venture. So whatever it is that comes up, I bring to her as a part of the joint venture, and then I expect her to join in. And when she is missing something, she brings it to me as part of the joint venture, and she expects me to meet her with whatever it is that's missing.
I feel as though we're going through some major changes right now. Women have started backing off of carrying full responsibility for a relationship because many of them have been left with nothing. If the relationship didn't work out and they hadn't worked things through in life and weren't able to take care of themselves, they were left high and dry. The picture that always comes to mind is the group of women that had put their husbands through medical school, through law school, or through dental school, and then had nothing when the relationship dissolved, and when they needed to go to work or take care of things in the world, they had no careers, no professions, no way to take care of themselves. So women now have stepped back a little bit from making relationship as their primary focus and have started to take care of themselves in the world. So that won't happen. The daughters of these women are very careful not to allow that to happen to them. And as they've pulled back from assuming full responsibility for relationship, as they've separated, from the patriarchal inner demands and outer demands, relationship has been left a little bit to languish. And this gives the space for the men to come in, for the men to start to accept some responsibility, for the men to see that relationship is important, that this man-woman thing, that marriage, that families are really important in life. And it makes things more important in the overall picture. It's no longer, well, relationship is something women do and they do it at home and nobody pays much attention to it. And if there's something wrong with the relationship, the woman is the one who has to get the man to the therapist. And it's always the woman who's nagging about, why don't we take vacations together? Why don't we have quality time? Why aren't you with us, me, the children, etc.? And it's beautiful to see when men come in, start taking responsibility and saying, you know, this is important. Relationship is important. Relationship is sacred.
So, Hal, do you have anything to add to those things?
Another thing that jumps into my mind is a situation that we see very often where, let's say, a man works and creates income and the woman is home with children. In that situation, it's very important that the woman be part of the financial structure of the family. The typical thing that happens in that situation is that the man essentially handles the money and the woman handles the children. Now, there's nothing wrong with a man working and making money and the woman raising the family, but the woman has to have a say in what happens to the money. When she bows out of any kind of responsibility for finances, they go into a certain pattern with each other where he becomes father and she becomes daughter on the whole materialistic level. The other thing is that the man has to be part of the family rearing decisions, so that's not left altogether to the woman. Otherwise, the woman goes into mother to the man's son so far as raising children is concerned, you see. So what it means simply is that both people have to take responsibility for both sides. Otherwise, it has very bad results in relationship. When a woman really gives up knowledge of finances just because her husband is the one who's working, it does bad things to relationship. The last point that I want to cover concerns the need to have some kind of connection to some higher order of being. You can call that God, if that feels good to you. God feels good to us. You can call that universal energies. If you belong to a church and that satisfies the need, that's fine. But life is immensely complex. And very often we live through times that are very, very difficult in relationship. To be connected to some higher order of reality, and to know that that's there, and to know that you can ask help of that kind of source is extremely important. Frankly, for myself, I can't imagine how people live without that. I know people do, but I can't imagine how they do it. For us, it's been a source of enormous strength and support.
What about somebody who's a committed atheist or does not want to believe in anything except material reality? What effect would that attitude have on their relationships?
I believe that it results in a certain narrowing of perspective in the relationship, because when things go wrong, they can only deal with it in a fairly narrow wave band. The fact is that we can get a lot of help from inside ourselves. If you're a meditator, for example, and you have the ability to sit down alone or sit down with your partner and allow things from the inside to come up, new ideas, new ways of looking at things, new ways of feeling begin to emerge. It's the same with the dream process. If you ask this higher source for help, you very often get dreams that bring solutions to problems that you never ever could have thought of before. Without that source, you have to rely essentially on your mind. The mind is a very important and effective primary self, gives you a lot of information, but it's only one primary self and its solutions are limited. It would be like buying a computer with software to do a financial program and not being able to use that computer for anything else but a financial program. That would be a tragedy. In a committed relationship, you need many, 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 many different kinds of software to do the job. So the connection to the higher source, for us, is a meaningful one.
So what about voice dialogue itself? How do you actually do it?
So you come to see me and you have a very strong part of you that has to do with being responsible in the world. We've talked about your life. We have some picture of which of these selves is very important. And then I might say to you something like, well, Michael, you seem to favor a lot this part of you that acts responsibly in the world. It's been with you for a long time. I think it might be interesting to really separate that part off and talk to it, objectify it. Is that okay with you? I want to get your permission, okay? You say, yes, it's okay. Then you literally take the chair that you're sitting in and move it to another space. Now, you'll either move it to the right or to the left, but you find your physical space in the room. You don't have to move the chair. There might be another chair or a couch. The point is, you go to this new physical space. Once you're in that physical space, I then begin to talk to you as that responsible self. And I might say something like, so you're the part of Michael that feels that it's very important to act responsibly in the world. And I begin to carry on this conversation with responsibility. Now, you can talk to one of these selves for just a few minutes, and you can talk to one of these selves for 2 hours, because they have a great deal of information. You find out, first of all, what their job is in the personality. How do you help Michael? What do you do for him? What's your role in the marriage? What's your role in child rearing? What's your role at work? Is there anything that you do that doesn't work in his life? What kind of people can't you stand? When were you born in Michael's life? You see, you have the opportunity to ask all kinds of questions.
So when you're talking about his life, such as, how do you behave and what effect does it have in his life, who is the his that you're referring to here?
The his is the person that sat down initially and came when you walked into the room. So the his life would be either the aware ego or the operating ego. It's really a combination of both. But it's the one who first sat down. But we do that kind of separation of language because it helps the aware ego in the separation. It helps the aware ego to recognize and experience the fact that it is not responsibility, but rather it has a relationship to responsibility.
So the aware ego is always in the middle seat.
The aware ego is always in the middle seat, exactly. After a certain period of time passes, when the facilitator feels that it has enough information for this particular session, the facilitator might say something like, I want to thank you very much for talking with me. Let's go back now to the aware ego. Then the physical you gets up and moves back to this position where you are right now. And then we take some time to talk about that. I might say, do you have a sense of that voice in you now as something separate? And generally people do have a sense of it as a separate voice. So here you're very happy to discover that you're not identified with responsibility. But then I say, well, imagine a few sessions have passed and you have separated from this responsibility voice. And now we feel that you're ready to deal with something that's on the other side. And I say to you, Michael, it seems that you have a self on the other side that's very much the opposite of that one. I think it would be valuable for us to talk to that voice. It seems like somebody who is more selfish or would like to have more time to himself. How do you feel about that? And you say, well, okay. And then we move you over. In this case, we ask you to move to the opposite side. When we're dealing with opposites, we prefer opposite sides. So now physically you get up and either move the chair or go to another chair, and now you're sitting over here to your right. And I say, hello, I understand that you're a very different part of Michael. Can you tell me about yourself?
And at that point, do I feel something different again?
Well, remember, it's this selfish one that's talking, and he feels something very, very different. And he breathes a sigh of relief, and he says, thank God I finally have the chance to talk, because I never get a chance in his life to come out. I mean, he never listens to me. And I say, well, you know, what would you do? What would be different in Michael's life? And I conduct an interview, and I find out what it is he stands for. How would life be different? So this disowned self really can have a lot of emotion and passion and want to do crazy things. When you first talk to a disowned self in voice dialogue, they very often come out in a very strong way because they've been imprisoned. You know, it's like an underground prison they've been in. Once they have a chance to talk a few times, that original passion may not be there once they get used to the fact that they're out and that you're taking them seriously.
So it's purely a matter of a conversation, you ask a question. There's no hypnosis or trance states or meditation or any other therapy going on?
No, it's not. A lot of people say, well, that's hypnosis, but we don't do any formal hypnosis at all. It is the case when you're in one of these selves that you are in an altered state of consciousness.
What does that mean?
Well, what it means, in other words, is that your consciousness isn't normal. If you're in one of these voices, and I, for example, judge that voice, people can get very upset. Or if the phone rings and I get up to answer the phone and you're in your responsible voice, people get very upset. You might not get upset in this place, but the voices get upset. So one has to be very careful when you're talking to these voices to honor the fact that it's not just an ordinary consciousness as when you and I are talking. It is a little bit different, but we don't see it as a hypnotic state.
So why would they get upset?
You know, basically, when somebody is facilitating someone else in voice dialogue, the facilitator is holding the aware ego. Each of these selves is a psychic unit. It's not the whole picture. So as the facilitator, you're holding the responsibility of keeping the structure, the session, the safety. You're literally the person in charge. If you let go of that by answering the phone or by interacting in a negative way, the self is going to be very, very, very upset. We find that selves are hypersensitive to criticism. The self, if I'm talking to your responsible father and I'm trying to manipulate him a little bit, or I have an agenda, or I have a question that I'm asking that I want a particular answer to, like, don't you think you were a little bit overworked last week or something like that? He's going to smell that. He's going to smell that. Their senses of perception, each self's sense of perception is incredibly finely honed. It's almost as though it's a camera or a sensing organism that just works with a certain part of the spectrum. And in that part of the spectrum, its focus is exquisite. It's exquisitely fine. And if you fiddle around at all, it's going to know it, and it's going to know you better than you know yourself in terms of facilitation. So it keeps us really, really honest. And one of the things we do say is that if, as facilitator, you find yourself getting judgmental or irritated with a self, that one of the things to do is to stop and to go back to the aware ego and not engage a self that you are not able to deal with in a completely accepting and allowing fashion.
So what happens after you complete the work with the disowned selves, the opposites?
Then I would ask the person to move back to the aware ego, and now you would be where you are. And I would say to you, now can you feel these two opposite selves, the responsibility to your left and the selfish side to your right? Incidentally, you might provide your own names for these selves. We don't necessarily give them names. We try, if we can, to have the subject give them the names. So I use these names just so long as you understand they could be called anything. I want now to do everything I can to give you as much sense of reality as I can about these two systems. So we might talk about it for a while, and as I'm talking, I'm trying to help you to clarify these two people. I might say to you, do you have a sense now of why it is that this other person has not had much chance to function in your life? And I'll ask questions like that to help you to begin to look back at the totality of your life and understand really why this person became a primary self, why this one got shut out, and what might be the consequences of this one if you began to learn how to use him. What people are always afraid of is, and they'll often say, you know, I don't want that person running my life. That's the last thing in the world. You know, my father was just like that. It's the last thing in the world I want. So you have to make it very clear that the point of this work is not to let him take over. So we use analogies like, you know, it's like you were driving a car. He's been driving your psychological car since you were 3 years old. That's who you've been. Now at this moment, he's not driving the car, you are. We don't want him to drive your car. We want you to learn how to drive your car, and we want the two of them to sit next to you and to give you advice, and then you make the decisions.
So when you're saying him, he, and person, you're referring to each individual self?
Each individual self, right. That's exactly what we're doing. There's now another step that we introduce in voice dialogue that's very valuable, and that is we introduce the awareness level. So the way we do that is we ask the person to stand up and stand next to us, facing the chair, the empty chair. And we say to the person, this is the awareness level of consciousness, the witness state. Let me summarize for you the work that we've done here this morning or this afternoon. I'd like you not to talk while I share these thoughts, because if you talk, that will essentially take you away from awareness, and you can correct it when you're back in the aware ego. And I then summarize. I say, first of all, we worked with the part of Michael that represents his responsible self. And I go on and explain that. And then I talk about coming back to this place. Then we moved over to the other side. And there we spoke to the part of him that's more selfish, that disappeared because his father was selfish, and he didn't want to be that kind of person. So, and so forth and so on. And then back to the aware ego. The person stands in this awareness, and then we say, whenever you're ready to come back to the aware ego, go back. So then they go back to the aware ego place where you're sitting now, and we're quiet for a while. So now what we've done is we have fulfilled the 3 levels of consciousness that is our definition of consciousness. Awareness. Now for many people that's a very powerful experience to step back here and have us explain what happened when they're not talking. The level of awareness that's triggered can be quite profound. We have awareness. We have the experience of the selves. You've experienced now the responsibility voice and the selfish voice. And we have the beginning of an aware ego process that can handle the two sides. Now, right now, when I say the beginning, the one on your left, the responsibility voice, is still 90% of you, or 95% of you. This guy is very, very new. He's just 5% of you. But over 3 months and 6 months and a year, this percentage gets lower, the responsibility side, and this percentage gets higher as you get stronger.
How many times over a year, or whatever, would you have to have sessions in order for this to happen?
Anywhere from 1 to 5 or 10 over time. The more the better. They don't have to be as long, but separating from these primary selves is very difficult. It doesn't happen easily. When Sidra and I would work together on this in our relationship, I mean, she talked to some of my voices hundreds of times. Don't expect that from everyone, but the separations are hard. So it usually requires more than once. If somebody has really done a lot of work reading books and tapes, and they're familiar with the psychology of selves, and they start the work fully primed, they tend to get the separations much faster. If they know nothing about selves, it takes much longer. But certainly you want to expect that major systems like power and pusher and responsibility and pleasers, you have to think of 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times.
Can anybody learn voice dialogue?
Not anybody could learn it, because there are whole groups of people that might not respond to the technique. On a theoretical level, the answer is yes, anybody could learn how to do the work. We have a very strong recommendation about this. Voice dialogue is a very powerful transformational tool, and we recommend that it be done by qualified therapists, counselors, people that are licensed in their country or state or province or whatever it would be, and that if they're going to do the work themselves, that it be done under the supervision of such a qualified therapist or psychologist or counselor. And the reason is that it is an extremely powerful tool, and a therapist has a knowledge of many approaches to therapy, and hopefully this person would also be trained in voice dialogue and be qualified to use that as a tool. So that's the way we recommend that people get training. It's very important.
So are there any particular guidelines that we should be aware of?
When doing voice dialogue, both the facilitator, the person who's doing it, and the subject, the person who is going into the selves, have to retain some sense of responsibility for the session or for the situation. We feel that it's very important that each one doesn't go any further than he or she feels comfortable. For instance, if I'm facilitating you and I expect you or ask you to go into a self that you don't want to go into, your job is to say no. Conversely, if I, as the facilitator, am planning to facilitate a self, I should not facilitate anything in you that I don't know in myself, or that I'm not comfortable with in myself, because I'm responsible for holding the energy of that self in you, and I have to know that I can do it. So this issue of responsibility is very important. Secondly, it's important not to go beyond levels of comfort. If I am a facilitator, and if I find that you're getting very, very intense, and I start feeling uneasy, this is not a time for heroics. I have to say, well, that's enough right now, and let's go back to the aware ego. Because I need to be able to always maintain control of myself and of the situation. I, as the facilitator, am the acting aware ego for the group. So it's very important not to go beyond my level of comfort. Sometimes, people will like to use this as a chance to get into very emotional states, very negative states. And we've seen people who will go to facilitators and literally try to entice them into working with very, very powerful antisocial energies or very aggressive energies. And the facilitator has to be able to sense this and keep proper boundaries for himself or herself. Another guideline would be, if I'm working with you as facilitator and I find myself starting to judge your voice, to be able to stop that. Because what it means is I'm just facilitating a disowned self of my own. Then if you're a friend, I might ask you to facilitate the primary self that's gotten triggered, or go home and do my own work, but not facilitate a voice that we judge. Okay? Another is to not push, not try to work too hard at it, to relax. This self that we're talking to is a person, and we're doing an interview. And as soon as we find there's a tremendous pressure to produce something, we ourselves as facilitators can assume we're in a primary self, some kind of pusher, some kind of achiever, somebody who has to get the job done, somebody who's taking a lot of responsibility in the session, rather than being able to sit and be with the self and allow it to emerge. Because voice dialogue in many ways is like a birthing process, and you're helping each self to emerge in its entirety. You're not going up there and pulling it down, you're allowing it to emerge in its own time. To remember that these are altered states, to deal with them, Hal's spoken about that, but to deal with them as altered states and to hold a safe space for that. And perhaps most important, to remember at the end of a session never to leave a person in a voice, in a self. That we always want to be sure there's a separation from the selves that are being worked with.
What does that mean, to leave a person in a voice?
If I've worked with your child and you walk out of my office or my house and you haven't separated from that child is who's going to walk out onto the street. If I've been working with your anger self, your anger voice, if I don't give you 10 or 15 minutes to come back into your aware ego and say, what is the meaning of this voice in your life? To ground you back in the aware ego. If I don't do that, the self itself is still running the car, is still driving the car. So we have to be sure that you're back, that you're grounded, that you're there. Now, this is all far safer when we're working with primary selves. That's why we talk over and over and over again about working with primary selves. The disowned selves are something that can come in way down the line when there's a strong aware ego that we know can assume responsibility for the life, for the ongoing life of the individual. The separation from the primary self is the important differentiation to make. And if the person goes back into the primary self, for instance, if you go back into your responsible self, it's not going to make much of a difference if the aware ego dissolves. If, on the other hand, you go out in your vulnerability or in your anger or in your selfishness, and this has not been a primary self, that can disrupt your life. We're not looking to flip. So the emphasis is always on primary selves and aware ego. Primary selves and aware ego. And that keeps the situation safe and solid. To kind of sum up, when we're doing voice dialogue, it should be fun, it should be easy. If it stops being fun, if it stops being an adventure, if it stops being something that engages us, then we're working too hard at it. And voice dialogue, the conducting of these particular conversations and interviews with selves, is like an instrument. And each of us plays this instrument idiosyncratically. We bring to this instrument the totality of who we are. Each of us will play it differently. and it will make totally different music depending on the musician.
Thank you both very much.
Thank you.